Okay. Right, so morning everyone. So as I said, I run Songbird Hypnotherapy, which is solution-focused hypnotherapy. So I see a range of clients who are suffering with things that are holding them back in life, so general anxiety, depression, confidence, weight management, insomnia, all sorts of things. So today I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how our brain works and what happens when anxiety is created in our brain and what we can do to help that. So this is a stress bucket, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, which I've just put together myself. So you can see in the middle you've got what we refer to as a stress bucket. So every time we get anything, stressful situation in our lives, anxiety, anything like that, it can overflow and we get lots of different symptoms as a result. So I won't run through all of those, you can see them, but you can see you've got your anxiety, depression, sleep issues is a huge problem, not just currently, but with anybody suffering from any kind of stress or anxiety. Weight management I'm seeing a lot of at the moment. Binge eating, I think, over lockdown, mood's gone down, reaching for food, etc. And I haven't popped it on there, but also migraine seems to be quite a big problem at the moment as well. But you can see there are a lot of the symptoms that if we have got stress or anxiety in our lives, then this is what can happen as a result. So if we have a look at the brain, so I don't know if you can see my mouse. So this is the part you know as you. So this is your conscious part, the part that interacts with the world, and the part you're using to be aware of interactions now. So when we operate from this part of the brain, we generally get things right in life, it will make a proper assessment of the situation, and it's generally very positive. But there's another part of our brain, so this bottom part is the primitive and emotional brain. So the centre and influential bit of that brain is the amygdala, which is generally referred to as the fight or flight area of the brain. And then you've got your hippocampus, which stores all your previous and inappropriate, sometimes inappropriate behavioural experiences or patterns. And then you've got your hypothalamus, which is the part that regulates all the chemical responses and hormones in your body and mind. So if you imagine that you were going to leave your house today and you were going to run into a polar bear on the street, for example, so what would happen? You would lose that intellectual control and you would drop to the primitive part of your mind. So your heart rate would increase, your palms would go sweaty, your stomach would be churning, and you'd be off like a shot. So in those circumstances, that response would be entirely appropriate and you would be pleased. So unfortunately, it's the same in life. So when our anxiety goes up, and this can either be that it goes up instantly or it can be a gradual process, we lose this intellectual control, and to a greater or lesser extent this primitive mind takes over. And the way that that primitive mind takes over is it either uses anxiety, depression, or anger, or a combination of all three of those things. So this primitive mind is a very negative mind, so it will always see things from the worst possible perspective. So if you think about it, it has to for your self-preservation. So if you imagine, you know, that you are going to run into that polar bear, your brain isn't automatically going to think, oh, it's fine, I'm going to carry on walking, everything's all right. It's going to step in to protect you because it's going to think, oh my God, it's going to get me. So that's the self-preservation part of your brain, which is entirely natural that we have. But unfortunately, it doesn't know the difference between when to step in and when it's appropriate to step in and when it isn't appropriate to step in. It's also an obsessional mind, so if there was a polar bear in your back garden, you'd be reminded of it constantly and you'd have to keep checking. And it's a vigilant mind, so if it thinks that there is danger all around us, then it's always going to be on red alert. So if you imagine for the past few months, there's been lots of anxiety, lots of people's brains are on that red alert, everything's unknown, they don't know what's going to happen, it's completely out of their control. Brain steps in, I don't know how to react, I'm going to defend myself. The way it defends itself is by creating that anxiety or that low mood or anything that comes as a result of that. So how do we create that anxiety then, which causes us to move from that intellectual part of our brain to the primitive part of our brain. So all anxiety is caused by negative thinking. So we know that it's not the events in our lives that necessarily cause that perception of crisis. So again, if that were the case, then everybody in the world right now would be suffering from panic attacks, and we know that's not the case. So we know that it's the thought patterns surrounding the events in our lives. So every negative thought that we have is converted into anxiety. So that can be big things like, I'll never be able to afford that, I'll never lose that weight, I'll never drop a dress size, I'll never get a new job, I'll never get that promotion. Or it can be small things. So it can be meeting, interviews. So intellectually, with that top half of your brain that I mentioned, you know that that meeting or that interview is going to go all right. Okay, but you being you start thinking about all the things that could go wrong. You think about 50 different scenarios, and by the time you've actually done the actual meeting or interview, which has been fine, you've attended 51 of them, and 50 of them have been disasters. So you've negatively forecast the future and created that anxiety as a result of that. So every negative thought that we have, we say it's accumulated and stored in what we call a stress bucket, which I mentioned briefly at the beginning. So the main way that we have of emptying this stress bucket is known as REM sleep, which some of you might have heard of. So during your REM sleep, it's the part of your sleep where you rerun the events of the day and move them from being an emotional memory to a narrative memory. So if you imagine that you have an argument with someone in the afternoon, you moan to your other half about it and they just say, oh, forget about it. You know, you can't forget about it. You go to bed, you're still angry, you're still upset. During your REM sleep, your brain will take the emotion away from that memory and move it from the primitive part of your brain to the intellectual part where you've got control over it. So when you wake up in the morning, you might have forgotten about it, you might not, but you'll certainly feel less angry and upset as you were the night before. So for one reason or another, that REM sleep is only restricted to 20% of our sleep pattern. So for example, if we was to sleep 10 hours, 2 hours of that would, on average, would be your REM sleep. So if we try and overdo this 20%, then the brain can wake us up in the middle of the night. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, lots of people suffering from stress and anxiety, generally they have real problems with sleep. And I know that currently, after the current situation, you know, there's been a lot of studies suggesting that a certain percentage of people are really struggling with sleep lately. So if this bucket is overflowing with all those negative thoughts and that stress and anxiety, and you try and overdo the 20% of your REM sleep, then you'll be waking up in the night. So you'll know the difference between that and the sound outside or your kids waking you up, etc. You'll feel wide awake, you won't be able to get back to sleep. Some people can have this where they find it difficult to get to sleep because this bucket is so overflowing with all the anxiety and stress that your brain doesn't know where to start and where to start emptying that bucket. Or on the other hand, some people have hypersomnia, which is when you find it, you're getting too much sleep and you're finding it difficult to wake up in the morning. So your brain has tried to overdo that 20%, which has overexerted so much energy on your brain, which is why it can be difficult to wake up in the morning. So you can see how we can get in the grip of a vicious cycle. So the more you have in that stress bucket, the more it builds up in it, the more you're encouraged to think negatively, the more time you spend in that primitive brain, the more you're then putting back in that bucket, you're not sleeping properly, so you're not emptying it, and it all becomes a big vicious cycle. So if we think back to primitive times, so we know that early men and early women were given rewards for carrying out certain evolutionary processes. So we know that they got rewards when they hunted and gathered and provided for themselves and their families. And we know that this made them braver and cope with pain and cope with fear, etc. So we know what that reward is. And it's a chemical response in the brain that produces various neurotransmitters. And the one we talk about the most is serotonin, which some of you have probably heard of. It's generally referred to as a happy hormone. So when we produce a nice constant flow of serotonin, like we've got here, we're happy, we cope well with life, we're positive, and we make rational decisions using that intellectual and rational part of our brain. So what causes us to dip down? So we either can dip down into this low mood, this depressed end, where we're not producing any chemicals at all, or we can go up into this anxious end when we're producing an overload of adrenalines or stress hormones. So you can see that we've got quite a large rise and fall with that level of serotonin. And that's because serotonin has a very short shelf life in the brain. So when we do something that makes us happy, it gives us that boost, but then it can drop very quickly and get absorbed in the brain very quickly. That's why it's so important to stay on top of producing this constant flow. And the way that we can do that, and we refer to it as 3 Ps. So we call it positive actions, positive interactions, and positive thoughts. And the more that we're doing these 3 things and being aware of them, the more we're producing this constant flow. And then we're moving into our intellectual brain, we're emptying that stress bucket, we're sleeping better, and we're getting that nice cycle that we would want to have, rather than if we were in this end or up this end, then we're not emptying that bucket, we're not getting that REM sleep, and we're encouraged to think negatively and with that primitive mind. So tips going forward. So the positive thoughts, actions and interactions. So I always encourage people to start writing things down. So I'd say start with minimum 3 things a day that have been good for you. And they don't have to be huge things that you've achieved. It can be as simple as having a cup of tea, enjoying a nice meal, something that's been fun with your kids that day. Interactions can always be animals as well, so that's really important. Animals are great. If you've had like a nice walk with your dog or a cuddle with your cat or whatever, anything that has just made you happy, just jot it down. I tend to do it just as I go along throughout the day. So if something comes up, I just make a little note of it in my diary or on my phone. I have some clients that do it as a task at the end of the day and reflect on that day. And the more you get into the habit of doing that and recognizing those positive things in life, the more you produce that constant flow of serotonin, the less you're putting in that bucket because you're not being encouraged to think negatively. And then it all flows nicely. And then small achievable goals. So as I talked about, when you can negatively forecast in the future, if you are setting yourself a huge target without a timeline, you're automatically setting yourself up for failure. So as an example, if someone says, right, I'm going to lose a stone by the end of the year. Okay, that's too much. Your brain doesn't know where to start. It panics, and then you automatically fail. So breaking those goals down into really small, achievable steps. So what could you do first? When could you see yourself doing it? Where could you see yourself doing it? And really creating a real visual picture in your mind so that every step is achievable. And say about going up a mountain. So if you're at the bottom of a mountain, you're not just going to be automatically able to jump to the top of that mountain. You have to go up it in small little steps, and there's obstacles to get round when you're going up that mountain. But if you break it down into little steps, then you're going to get there a lot more easily, and it's going to be a lot more achievable. Then just to finish, I just put a little couple of quotes on there which I feel are quite relevant. So every day might not be good, but there's something good in every day. So it's so easy for us to reflect on the negative things that happen, which is why we encourage people to think about those small positives and train their brain to be able to think on that. The negative side of our brain is actually the larger and stronger part. So it's all about building up the positive part and to be able to use that. And then the Dalai Lama said there's only 2 days in the year that nothing can be done. So yesterday and tomorrow. So it's all about focusing on where we are today, what's achievable now, rather than worrying what's happened in the past or what could be achieved in the future. And that's done.